Welcome to God and Autobiography, the podcast. I'm Scott Langdon, and I join Jerry Martin this week as we return with what's on our mind. In this episode, Jerry and I talk about our spiritual senses, what they are, and how we can use them to get in tune with God's will for our lives. But once we understand our spiritual senses and what they're capable of, how do we go about trusting the guidance we seem to be getting? What is trust exactly? And what does it mean to trust in something or someone? How do we go about trusting in God? Here's what's on our mind. I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of What's on Our Mind. I'm Scott Langdon. I'm with Jerry Martin here, and we have a rich array of things to talk about today. And when I say array of things, we're going to be focusing on a point that Jerry brought up in his From God to Jerry to You episode in this unit, which was episode 273. In that, he talks about trusting your spiritual senses. And Jerry, when you had your intimate dialogue with Abigail, and you were talking about this, you mentioned after a little bit more of an investigation that it might not have actually been spiritual senses, but spiritual sensors, which I thought was really interesting. They both mean roughly the same thing. But this idea of being able to pick up on what God is intending for our lives through our spiritual senses. When I think of senses, I think of our five senses.
The five senses.
Sight, smell, sound, taste, hearing, and touch, and being able to sort of equate that idea. I just think of how different all of my senses, those five senses are, and yet they are all, in a sense, that's funny, but they are all directed at the same thing, which is helping me sort of interpret the outside world and help me kind of figure out where I am and what my balance is, where I'm headed, where I'm moving. If I think about that in a physical way, my senses, they all play an important role, and they're varied. And when we lose one, if we start to, maybe we're deaf or we're blind or something happens, or we're without one, maybe by birth, what it might be, we figure out a way to work without that one, or, you know what I mean? So there's all kinds of ways in which the senses are so important. And spiritually, I think that's a really great way to look at it too. When we're thinking about where do we want to go in our life? What's our direction? What's our purpose? How can we make sure that we know we're going in the right way, that we're not going to bang into something, or that we're not going to fall over somewhere, or, our spiritual senses play an important role.
Yeah, I was just puzzling as you were talking. Is this a metaphor, spiritual senses, or is it more or less literally true that in addition to the five senses, there are some more senses, that when you look not just at the person as a physical organism, you might say the physical organism has eyes and ears and so forth, and that kind of restricts the domain of what those senses tell us. They certainly tell us about the world that organism encounters. But we're more than just a physical organism. We're minds, spirits, souls. And I guess my view is that the soul is by its nature related to the divine. And so I guess it's not actually just a metaphor. It's just you've got to expand your conception of what the person is. What are all the things you take in? And as I'm encountering you, and because we're doing it by Zoom, I can see you. Well, I'm taking in the Scott, not just Scott's body. I'm taking in Scott. That's one of our interesting phenomena about our human relations. We relate to each other as whole people, except when we're using somebody or something like that, or trying to sell them some garbage bags or something, then you're delimiting the person you're dealing with. But you're normally dealing with a full person, and that includes your own full person, and your own full person has these things that I think are not just metaphorical senses. It's just you've got to extend the meaning to include things that aren't pinned down to eyes, ears, etc., to what your whole self is taking in. And your whole self is taking in a lot. And of all kind of whole reality, you might say, that includes the divine glimmers and divine glimmers and insights, prompts, especially relevant to your life often.
God comes to us in so many different ways, and each one of us in a very personal way. And in this latest Radically Personal episode, which is episode 275, you talk about, and you spent some time with William James, reading some William James, and talking about how he felt like the individuality was the point, really, to a large extent. That the fact that each one of us never has been duplicated, replicated. We talked about this, I think, on another episode, that's one of the things that blew my mind, just really contemplating the idea that each one of us is completely unique. And that just means to me, especially as somebody, as an actor, it's so exciting to create a new person every time I'm in a new job. Even if I played the role before, it's so interesting because it's different because I'm different. So each one is such a unique thing. And so I imagine it must be such an interesting idea for God to experience the world or experience otherness as all of this incredibly rich, diverse things. God's got to go through life as me. God's got to go through life as you and as Abigail and as this tree and my dog, and like every experience that's possible. And it seems to be driven by this spirit of curiosity and imagination, which is where I think we have a real connection with God, the idea that we have an imagination. And so when we look for a purpose or what we would like our life to be, what our calling might be, which is another thing that you and Abigail talk about this week as well, that the idea of a calling, having it be so particularly unique to us can at the same time overwhelm us because there's so much noise from the outside. You should do this, you should do that, you should do the other. And also the idea of what fits us can sometimes seem so out of reach. I won't be my full self until I've become a doctor or until I've done this or until I've gotten this award or this accomplishment. And so we always feel like that purpose is just out of reach. And what compounds that oftentimes is feelings of worth in ourselves get really low and low and low because we say, I can't find my quote unquote purpose. And so I'm just gradually losing self-worth. So the idea of trusting your spiritual senses about what is God and what is, not of God. You talk about spiritual discernment. How can we focus our spiritual senses so that they are aptly ready to receive the kind of messages we need to receive?
Yeah, I think the good news is you're talking about all this complexity and options, and the world's going every which way, and possible vistas of imagination with maybe we should be this and that, and you should be on Broadway and so forth.
Right,
There are
right.
all of these things, or maybe somebody's I'm married wonderfully, but someone can be in a marriage and is this the right marriage, and so on. Oh, here's someone else. And anyway, there's all of this. And your job is your job. You're going to lose your job. Oh, prices, everything's so expensive. There's all this stuff. And the simplicity is you just have to put all that aside. Put all that aside. And take a deep breath. And this is why people often go off to the woods or to a little private place that they meditate or pray, or I was reading some Hindu material, they often have a little a place in the home that's kind of a little shrine or something with a Krishna thing, and they just go and sort of meditate and pay, do whatever you're supposed to do. I think they actually bring food for Krishna, So you go through those things and they quiet the soul, separate it from the rest of all this cacophony that we're immersed in. And what I always find, just from my own prayer experience, if I'm all agitated about something or distracted or this is going on and I'm, oh my God, what about this? I can't pray effectively. I'm stumbling over myself, like trying to run up the stairs too fast, and you just trip. Just quiet down, Jerry. And so that you might say it's just you there, or you and God there, you and whatever comes to you in that quiet moment. And I sometimes use this concept of the clarified soul, which by which I don't mean super duper spiritual disciplines or something. There are traditions that teach you how to do that. But no, I don't think all that's quite required for most of us. Maybe it's required for certain kinds of spiritual journeys. But for most of us, we just need to quiet down and then kind of, as you say, Scott, listen, what comes to you? And I use prayer as the best because I put a question, what is it I want to know from God? And then I write down what comes to me. And I've suggested people try to that, even if they don't have my kind of relation to God, where God spoke to them and so on and so forth. Just write down what comes to you. And keep in mind the possibility there's some divine element in that. So that's just one technique, but it's just quiet. So it's just you. And if God has something to open to you, you're open to it and you can take it in. And then, think what does it mean? And you think about that too. Okay, this may be kind of vague. Well, think about it some more. Pray or meditate or just get in touch with whatever's deepest inside you and let it direct you.
There's an idea that you explain called an epistemics of trust. And we've encountered that phrase before, and I have spent some time with it in my own contemplation and prayer life, what that means, epistemics of trust. And I've looked up a number of times the definition of trust, which is a firm belief in the reliability, truth, or strength of someone or something. So I think, okay, I can trust someone. I'm relying. I have a firm belief in their reliability. But then I also think about a trust as in a fiduciary relationship and what that means, that there's two sides to it. And if
What do you mean by fiduciary?
Fiduciary, sort of in the sense of, let's say you're keeping property or monies in a trust for your children or grandchildren until they're of age. And in a sense, I kind of feel that's a relationship. It's a type of relationship that we have with God, in the sense that we're always coming into our inheritance.
Yes.
It's language that's used often in religious and theological discourse, inheritance. And when I think about both of those ways of looking at the word trust, they have a lot in common, I think, when I think about our relationship with God and our relationship with one another.
Yes.
So if you could talk a little bit about the epistemics of trust and how it relates to what our calling is and how to receive our calling and kind of know that it's our calling, when we're open with our spiritual senses and we're receiving this calling, we have to trust that it is that. And it might change roads. It might look different along the way. Maybe you start out as a teacher and then something else happens. It's, oh, I have lost my calling. Well, maybe not. Maybe it looks a little different down the road. But the trust, we often use the word faith. And you and I talked before we got on air here that faith is a word that's difficult to use sometimes, often misunderstood. So could you talk a little bit about that epistemics of trust?
Yeah, the epistemic trust I introduced as mainly that you can't know anything unless you trust something. And I argued in Radically Personal mainly for everything we know and think about starts with experience. We encounter something, and experience isn't just an inner flux. We're encountering the world. Experience is more like a window to the world, and things are coming in, and you need to trust them. And among the things and then you trust them critically. In other words, you don't just accept the first glance of something coming into your experience. You then think, oh, is there another side to it? Or is there more to the story? Or is this even, I was agitated and therefore I saw what happened. Maybe a witness to a crime scene may have misseen as comes out in the eyewitness report that was agitated, saw it and with a kind of bias. But the crucial thing in the spiritual life is that you have to learn to trust not just facts, not just observations in a kind of scientific or daily sense, but ideas, intuitions, impulses, even imaginings that come to you as informative. And that's this key part in the spiritual life of openness. You've got to have an open soul, take in what is coming, and the trust part comes that if you have an insight, I was just reading an author who a certain imagining, you might say, comes as if it were real. And this remarkable writer trusted. She doesn't know if it's real or not real because it's kind of unworldly. You kind of have a sort of vision of something more or less impossible, like someone visiting you in a dream. I've had that experience, and most are just, I dreamed about so-and-so. Every once in a while, I've had a dream in which it seems natural to say, so-and-so visited me in a dream. And the bias of trust is, okay, take that. That's data. That's data. Don't say, oh, that can't be. It's puzzling. You don't know exactly how it can be, but take it and at first, don't throw it out in advance of taking in what it has to tell you. And then the other thing you were talking about, Scott, becomes crucial at this point. You start with trust, you take things in, you pay attention, you listen, and let every experience, intuition, imagination tell you what it has to tell you. And then the crucial task is spiritual discernment. Because there are, if you use old language, there are also demons. There are various kinds of afflictions. Some of them are mental illness, after all. Some are just hyper, or some are just momentary comings and goings within your consciousness. And well, you just can't. If you think a voice is saying jump off the bridge, you don't just jump off the bridge. You kind of ponder it first. And you try to, as St. Paul says, you discern the spirits. Is the voice of God? Is this a spirit actually of God that's leading me? And that's true in whatever religious tradition you're talking about. You have to sort and separate out. And then you can get kind of adequately inspected and adequately uh, looked at from different sides and sort out what's the valid element here in the context of your own life. Apply it correctly, which may not be what it quite appeared at first glance, but as you pay attention to it and what's coming, and always with this sense of the clarified soul of the distractions being out. It's not what are my ambitions, what are my desires, what are my fears, but no, just what is this telling me? That's especially what's it telling me relevant to me? Because that's who it's there for.
Yeah, and that kind of communication can come from so many different sources. When you and Abigail were talking about trusting your spiritual senses in the intimate dialogue, episode 274 this time, Abigail sort of starts right off with, she knows some folks and even in herself sometimes, and I can echo this for me, sometimes it's not best to listen to your own internals, your internal voices, your internal nudges alone, and that being the only thing that, who do you have around you as a team? Having a team of folks around you is so important because God will often speak through them as well. And I think about my wife, who has helped me, with my bipolar diagnosis, which is, that was 1999. So I've had a lot of time to see patterns and see how they work, and seasonal, literally seasons. So winter, where I am emotionally and mentally, and what spring is like for me, and all those things. We've sort of traced them over these years, and I've gotten to the point where I sort of know when it's coming, a certain low time or even a certain high time, which can almost be more difficult. And so maybe if I'm in a hypermanic time, my wife will say something like, "You need to finish your sentences, please." Because that's one of the things that I'll do is I'll not finish the sentence and I'll go on to another thing. And she'll just remind like that. And that's something that if I hear her say that, I realize, almost like a bell in the Buddhist tradition, when you're coming to meditation and you hear that bell, it's almost like that when she says that to me. Now, it used to be that I might get offended or feel bad about myself that I let myself have a moment like that I let her down or that I failed. And if she would say, "Can you finish your sentences?" I might have gotten upset and been, what, and then left or whatever.
Right.
But understanding and being ready and available as often as I can to hear God in me, and understanding that it could come from anywhere, any place, any time. I know that when I do act, I don't know what I've missed by acting like that in the past. I don't know. I don't think it's important to know that now. I just know that perhaps I did, and I don't want to in the future. So if she is saying to me, "Scott, can you finish your sentences?" what she's really doing is, in concern for me, she's showing me that I'm having a time that I need to maybe kind of reflect and maybe be quiet for a while and maybe listen, because I'm in this state. And maybe I need to talk to my therapist about it, or, whatever it might be. I'm open now to that. There was a director that I worked with a couple years ago now. I worked with him for the first time, and I realized that I was coming across a little too arrogantly, maybe. And when he talked to me about something, I realized it was the same kind of the thing. Like, he mentioned something about my behavior privately, and because we're friends, but I've never worked with him as a director. And when he said something about how I handled a situation in rehearsal, I realized I could have taken this as he was scolding me and, or I could take it as he's pointing something out to me. And in that moment, I realized, and I told him this later, he was God, an instrument of God to me at that moment. Because when I took it in and realized, yeah, well, this is how it's coming across, whether I meant this or that or the other. I didn't think I meant anything nasty or whatever, but that's how it came across. And so I have to be responsible for that. And then from then on, everything was wonderful. It was, but to be available for how is God coming from the outside and not just relying on, well, I know what's right on the inside and everybody else is against me. I just know what's in the inside. Well, even people who are calling you out for something, you have to face that and go, okay, we have to work. It is what it is, So being able to be present to that is important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, those are basic life skills. That's something important, even apart from whether it's God or not God, that we need to be able to learn from each other. And that kind of lesson where you can take this in assault, someone's pointing out, look, I thought you were kind of rude, speaking out of turn at that meeting, and you can take offense at that. Maybe it's right, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But the first thing to do is to take it in undefensively and kind of look at my behavior. Do I think I was rude? Was I out of turn? And usually they've got some point or they wouldn't be saying it. If somebody thinks it, then there's probably something a little off in what you did. And maybe they don't have it categorized quite correctly, but you go through that. That's a kind of discernment in life, that we all have to go through. That's part of the deep task of paying attention and being reflective and thoughtful. But in this, at the divine level, our essential instruments of our own spiritual journey are the people around us. And that's where who you trust comes in. You have to trust them too. The people who, especially if you kind of know they're on your side and they're giving you some feedback. Sometimes the person who's not on your side can give you valuable feedback too. That can also be God saying, step back, fella. As a friend of mine pointed out that even Jesus, he says, ask, who do they say I am? It's like he needed some validation. Who do they send? Peter, and I can't now remember the rest of it. You probably remember better than I do, but, he's wondering, am I the Messiah or what? And they have that conversation. It's early in God and Autobiography that I'm reporting to Abigail it's like a strange thing happened to me on the way to the forum. It's just these strange things. God talking to me. Well, God talked to me again today and said, blah, blah, blah. And then Abigail says, after I've done this for, I don't know, some weeks or whatever, are you going to take this voice seriously? Or is this just entertainment? Something to talk about, strange thing. Oh, well, that is when I started taking it seriously, because I realized for my agnostic modern person, none of this, I was too secular for it to quite make sense. So it was just bizarre experiences. But I did believe them, but I just couldn't embrace that belief. I was holding it at arm's length because when God told me to do things, I would do them. Because, well, they weren't jump off the bridge after all. They were harmless, though often seem meaningless. But I was still kind of holding it at arm's length. And and there was a matter of trust. Well, I trusted Abigail. I certainly trusted her love for me. And she's a perceptive person. So often one of the things you trust is another person's judgment. Mm-hmm. And with good reason, you know what their pattern of judging situations has been. So you trust it. And so, yeah, they can be, I asked Mark Rollo, we did an interview with, maybe his spiritual story. How did you become a minister? Well, in 1 week, I guess as he was talking about his theological studies or something, 3 different people told him, "You should be a minister." Hey, okay. And he became an impressively talented minister. Wonderful guy.
Yes, yes.
But that's the life we have. We got to listen to God's voice, however it's coming. It be something you're reading, a novel that makes you think about different types of situations, different ideas. It can be all these sources. One thing I saw on television. Here's another random input. Very early in my God journey, you might say, wondering how am I going to do this? I still had a career in Washington, D.C., pumping away in the power corridors of the District of Columbia, and not feeling, I can't be a St. Paul or a Dalai Lama or something. I'm just a guy, and a TV program happening to come on as I was just flipping around channels, and it was a religious station, and there was an interview, seemed kind of interesting, and it was a black guy who had become a gospel singer. And he was reporting, "I had never sung in my life, but I received, prayer guidance to start singing gospel." And I did. And he said, this was the line, I still remember it: "Those who God calls, he equips." In other words, so if you have a certain calling and you feel you have it and you check it out, then don't worry. The means will be there. And you probably have more capacity even in yourself, latent in yourself, than you realize. And so try that out with due diligence. Never jump off the bridge. That's not wise. But God tells you to do something, then trust that you can probably do it, or that the effort to do it will itself be a good thing.
Thank you for listening to God and Autobiography, the podcast. Subscribe for free today wherever you listen to your podcasts and hear a new episode every week. You can hear the complete dramatic adaptation of God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin by beginning with episode 1 of our podcast and listening through its conclusion with episode 44. You can read the original true story in the book from which this podcast is adapted, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher, available now at Amazon.com and always at godandautobiography.com. Pick up your own copy today. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, please email us at questions@godandautobiography.com and experience the world from God's perspective, as it was told to a philosopher. This is Scott Langdon. I'll see you next time.